Go eat at home. You don't belong at this table.
That was the moment Ethan Miller could no longer pretend. It wasn't the first time his family crossed a line, but it was the first time he truly saw it for what it was. Because it didn't begin at that table. It began years ago when he became the one everyone relied on to carry everything. Ethan Miller was the kind of man people depended on because he never said no. At 38, Ethan had the quiet, worn look of someone who carried more than he showed. He stood about 6 feet tall, lean but slightly slouched, as if years of responsibility had slowly bent his posture. His dark brown hair was always neatly trimmed, though a few strands of gray had started to appear at his temples. His face was calm, approachable, too approachable, some might say. It made people trust him. It also made them use him. He worked as a mid-level manager at an insurance company, a job that suited his nature, detail-oriented, patient, and endlessly reliable. The kind of man who read the fine print so others didn't have to. That same instinct followed him home. His daughter, Sophie, was 8, small, bright-eyed, with soft blonde curls and a cautious smile. And she had inherited her mother's gentleness and Ethan's habit of observing before speaking. She adored her father, even when he was distracted, even when he checked his phone too often. Claire, his ex-wife, was 36. She had sharp features, tired blue eyes, and the quiet strength of someone who had learned to stop asking for more. Once warm and hopeful, she had grown distant over the years, not out of anger, but exhaustion. Loving Ethan had felt like competing with an entire family she could never win against. And then there was Lily. Ethan's younger sister, 34, was vibrant in a way that drew attention instantly. Long, dark hair, stylish clothes, always smiling, but her life was a series of unfinished plans. She floated between jobs, apartments, and temporary setbacks, always landing softly because Ethan was there to catch her. "Hey, I hate to ask," her text read. Ethan didn't even finish reading it before opening his banking app. That was the pattern. That was always the pattern. Years ago, when their father lost money in a failed business, Ethan stepped in. When Lily needed rent, he covered it. When emergencies appeared, real or not, Ethan paid without question. No one forced him, but no one ever stopped him either. And somewhere along the way, being needed became the only way he knew how to be loved. The end of Ethan Miller's marriage didn't come with shouting or slammed doors. It came quietly, like something slowly fading out of existence. Claire had noticed it long before Ethan did. At 36, she carried herself with a calm restraint, her slim frame always composed, her blonde hair usually tied back in a simple ponytail. As a second-grade teacher, she was patient, warm with children, and endlessly giving. But even patience had limits. Years ago, she had grown up in a household where her mother stayed too long in a one-sided marriage, and Claire had promised herself she would never do the same. At first, she tried. She planned dinners, suggested weekend trips, even left small handwritten notes in Ethan's briefcase. But Ethan was always somewhere else, mentally calculating bills, responding to family texts, solving problems that were never truly his. The breaking point wasn't dramatic. It was Sophie's 8th birthday. Claire had spent weeks organizing a small party at Home Balloons, a homemade cake, a few classmates invited. Sophie wore a pale blue dress and kept glancing at the door, waiting. Ethan had promised he'd be there, but that afternoon, his phone buzzed. Lily needed money urgent, she said. Her rent was overdue, and her landlord, Marcus Klein, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a permanent frown and little patience for excuses, had given her until the end of the day. Ethan didn't hesitate. He left work early, drove across town, and handled it. By the time he returned home, the party was over. Half-deflated balloons hung from the ceiling. Paper plates were stacked in the sink. Sophie was asleep on the couch, still in her dress. Claire stood in the kitchen, arms crossed, not angry, just done. "You missed it," she said quietly. "I had to help," Ethan replied, as if that explained everything. Claire nodded slowly. That was the problem. He always had to. The divorce that followed was efficient, almost polite. No screaming, no drawn-out battles, just signatures, schedules, and silence. Two reasonable people dismantling a life that no longer worked. And when it was over, Ethan told himself nothing had really broken. But Claire knew the truth. It had been breaking for years. A week after the divorce papers were finalized, Ethan Miller's phone rang at 9:12 p.m., a time his mother seemed to reserve for emotional requests. Patricia Miller, 62, had a soft, carefully controlled voice, the kind that could sound loving while quietly steering every conversation. She was petite, always well-dressed, her silver-streaked hair styled neatly, and she had spent most of her life smoothing over conflicts, often by redirecting responsibility onto Ethan. "Your father's birthday is coming up," she said warmly. "We're doing something small. Nothing expensive. Just family." Ethan already knew what nothing expensive meant. His father, Richard Miller, 65, was a broad-shouldered man with a booming voice and an easy laugh that often masked his unwillingness to take accountability. Once a small business owner, he had lost most of his savings years ago and never quite recovered, leaning instead on Ethan's quiet reliability. "Saturday night," Patricia continued. "A place called Bellini's, very tasteful, not over the top." Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He had just finished reviewing his monthly expenses, child support, rent, Sophie's school supplies, and the numbers were tighter than usual. "Okay," he said. He said anyway. He always said, "Okay." Minutes later, his phone buzzed again. Lily, her Instagram story loaded before her message. A rooftop bar, city lights glowing behind her. A glass of wine held delicately in her hand. She looked flawless, long dark hair, perfect makeup, laughing beside her husband, Mark Reynolds, 37, a casually confident man with an athletic build and a permanent half-smile. The type who rarely worried because someone else always did. The caption read, "A much-needed night out." Then the text came. "Hey, quick favor. Can you send $120? Just temporary." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Another message appeared, this time from Claire. Simple, direct. "Try setting boundaries this time." He stared at those words longer than he expected. Claire rarely told him what to do anymore. That's what made it land. For the first time, Ethan didn't open his banking app right away. Instead, he sat there, phone in hand, feeling something unfamiliar creeping in beneath the preachness sense of obligation. Not anger, not yet. Just exhaustion. Still, when Saturday came, he got dressed, picked up Sophie, and drove to the restaurant, because even when something inside him started to shift, habit was hard to break. Bellini's was the kind of restaurant where everything felt polished, soft golden lighting, crisp white tablecloths, and servers who moved like they had rehearsed every step. Ethan Miller walked in with Sophie beside him, her small hand wrapped around his finger, her eyes quietly scanning the room. She wore a simple yellow dress, slightly wrinkled from the car ride, but she looked up at everything with quiet wonder. At the table, Patricia was already seated, smiling too brightly, while Richard leaned back in his chair like he owned the room. Lily arrived moments later, effortlessly stylish in a fitted black dress, her confidence filling the space before she even sat down. Mark followed, relaxed as ever. Tall, broad, with an easy grin that never seemed to fade, especially when he wasn't the one paying. Menus were handed out. Ethan barely had time to open his before Lily waved the server over. The waiter, Daniel Cruz, a slim man in his late 20s with sharp features and a professional calm, nodded as she spoke quickly. "We'll take the truffle pasta, the lobster risotto, and 2 of those to go as well." Ethan glanced up. "To go?" "For later," Lily said casually, not even looking at him. Mark chuckled, sipping his drink. "Got a plan ahead, right?" Sophie sat quietly, her fingers tracing the edge of the table. When the food arrived, the aroma filled the air, rich, buttery, impossible to ignore. 2 neatly packed boxes sat beside Lily, tied with a thin gold ribbon. Sophie's eyes lingered on them just a second too long before she looked down again. Ethan noticed. Of course he did. But before he could say anything, Richard leaned forward, his voice cutting through the moment. "Kids don't need all this," he said, with a dismissive wave. "They can eat at home." The words landed heavier than they should have. No one argued. Patricia smiled faintly, as if smoothing over something invisible. Lily kept scrolling on her phone. Mark laughed softly, like it was just another joke, and Sophie said nothing at all. She just sat there quiet, still, and suddenly smaller. The words lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. Sophie didn't react at first, but Ethan felt her hand tighten slightly in his. It was subtle, so subtle most people wouldn't notice. But Ethan had spent years noticing everything except the things that mattered most. Claire arrived just then, stepping quietly beside the table. She had come separately, still keeping a respectful distance after the divorce. Tonight, she wore a simple navy dress, her posture straight, her expression unreadable, but her eyes immediately found Sophie. Without a word, she moved closer and gently took Sophie's other hand, grounding her. Claire didn't interrupt, she didn't argue, she simply stayed present. The table tried to move on. Conversations resumed in fragments, forced laughter, clinking glasses, but something had shifted. Ethan sat still. So, staring at the plates, at the untouched bread, at the two neatly packed boxes near Lily. Then the bill arrived. It came in a black leather folder, placed carefully at the center of the table by Daniel, who sensed the tension but said nothing. For a brief second, no one moved. Then Lily nudged it toward Ethan. "Just put it on your card," she said lightly, like it was already decided. "You can sort it later." Mark leaned back, smiling faintly, completely at ease. Patricia avoided eye contact. Richard said nothing, but his silence carried expectation. That was the moment. Ethan reached forward, but not to take the bill. Instead, he looked up at Daniel. "Could we split this?" He asked calmly. "Separate checks." The words didn't sound loud, but they landed like something breaking. "What?" Lily blinked, her smile fading. Richard leaned forward, his voice low. "Don't start this." Ethan didn't raise his voice. He didn't explain. "One check for me and my daughter," he continued. Claire's hand tightened slightly around Sophie's. Lily pushed the bill closer again. "Ethan, stop. Just handle it." Ethan didn't touch it. No. One word, simple, final, and for the first time in years, he meant it. The silence after Ethan said no didn't last long. It cracked almost immediately, sharp, loud, and unforgiving. Richard's face hardened, his jaw tightening, as if he had just been personally insulted. "After everything we've done for you," he muttered, though the words felt rehearsed, like a line he had used before. Patricia followed with softer pressure, her voice trembling just enough to sound hurt. "This isn't like you, Ethan. You're not selfish." Lily didn't bother hiding her frustration. "It's a bill, not a war." She snapped, crossing her arms. Mark, still seated comfortably, let out a quiet laugh, though it lacked his usual ease this time. The entire table just turned toward Ethan, waiting for him to fold, to apologize, to fix it like he always did. But he didn't. The rest of the dinner passed in fragments, voices lowered, glances exchanged, tension sitting heavier than the untouched food. Ethan paid only his portion, signed the receipt without hesitation, and walked out with Sophie and Claire beside him. No one stopped him. The next morning, his phone exploded, missed calls, messages, a family group chat filled with accusations. Words like ungrateful, embarrassing, and selfish repeated in different forms. Ethan read them all once, then put the phone down. At 10:17 a.m., Lily texted him privately, "Hey, can you send $150? It's urgent." Ethan stared at the message for a long moment, then typed 2 letters. "No." That single reply felt heavier than anything he had ever said. He spent the afternoon going through his accounts, subscriptions tied to his card streaming services, shared plans, things he barely used. One by one, he canceled them. A quiet dismantling of habits that had once felt normal. Later that evening, and a call came from Harper's Auto Garage. The mechanic, Tom Harper, a stocky man in his 50s with grease-stained hands and a blunt tone, spoke plainly. "We've got a vehicle under Lily's name, but you're listed as backup payment." Ethan didn't hesitate this time. "I'm not responsible for that anymore." A pause, then, "Understood." And just like that, the pattern began to break. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was unfamiliar. For the first time in years, Ethan Miller's life felt quieter. Not easier, not perfect, but his time was finally his. It started small. One Tuesday evening, instead of answering messages or checking his accounts, Ethan stood in the kitchen with Sophie. She wore an oversized apron, her blonde curls tied messily, flour dusting her cheeks. Are we really making dinner? She asked, half excited, half skeptical. We are, Ethan said, rolling up his sleeves. Cooking had never been his thing. He used to rely on takeout, convenience, whatever saved time, but now he followed simple recipes, reading instructions carefully like he did at work. Sophie giggled when he burned the first batch of pancakes. He laughed too, a sound that felt unfamiliar in his own home. These moments added up to quiet dinners, homework at the same table, evenings without interruptions. At work, the shift was just as noticeable. Ethan no longer checked his phone every few minutes. He stayed focused, present. His supervisor, Karen Brooks, a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her early 40s with short auburn hair and a reputation for spotting potential early, had been watching him closely. She valued consistency, but what impressed her more was change. You've stepped up lately, she told him during a meeting. There's a senior position opening. I think you're ready. Ethan didn't answer right away, not out of doubt, but because he wasn't used to being seen for himself. Claire noticed, too. When she came to pick up Sophie one afternoon, she paused in the doorway, observing the small but undeniable differences, the clean kitchen, the calm atmosphere, the way Sophie clung to Ethan with easy comfort instead of quiet hesitation. Claire studied him for a moment, and her expression softening. You seem different, she said. I am, Ethan replied simply, and for once, it wasn't something he was trying to prove. It was something he had finally become. By the time spring arrived, Ethan Miller no longer felt the constant pull of expectation that had once defined his life. The silence from his family had settled into distance, not dramatic, not explosive, just absence. A few messages still came through occasionally, but they no longer carried weight. For the first time, Ethan wasn't reacting. He was choosing. One Saturday morning, sunlight filled the kitchen as Sophie sat at the table with crayons spread around her. Don't look yet, she said, covering her drawing with both hands, her small face serious with concentration. Ethan leaned against the counter, coffee in hand, watching her with quiet patience. Claire arrived shortly after, dressed simply in jeans and a soft sweater, her expression calm, but lighter than before. Over the past few weeks, she had begun staying a little longer during pickups, small conversations, turning into shared meals, cautious but real. She wasn't rushing back into anything, neither was Ethan. Okay now, Sophie said, turning the paper around. It was a drawing of a table, 3 stick figures sitting together, plates in front of all of them. No one missing, no one left out. Across the top, in uneven handwriting, she had written, "A real family eats together." Claire's eyes softened instantly. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest, but this time it wasn't pressure. It was clarity. Later that afternoon, they sat down, just the 3 of them, with a simple meal Ethan had cooked himself. Nothing expensive, nothing impressive. But every plate was full. Every seat was taken. Claire looked across the table at him, studying him in a way she hadn't in years. If we try again, she said quietly. It has to be different. Ethan nodded. It will be. No promises too big, no words he couldn't keep, just something steady. And for the first time, that was enough. Not perfect, but real. If you were Ethan, would you say no and walk away or keep paying just to be accepted by your own family? Would you risk being called selfish just to protect your child? Be honest. What would you really do? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to know.